Today, I'm going to show you how to save hundreds of thousands of dollars in retirement taxes by withdrawing from your 401k first without doing Roth conversions. Now, this couple that I'm going to show you today saved $100,000 in the first 10 years of retirement and will end up leaving $650,000 more to their heirs by doing the opposite of the conventional wisdom when it comes to withdrawal sequencing. They achieve all this while still qualifying for healthcare subsidies before Medicare. And so if you're this type of retiree, someone who is pre-Medicare age, retiring and sitting on a large pre-tax balance with a sprinkling of taxable or after-tax assets, then conventional withdrawal sequencing could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I'm going to show you why. Now, most of you have heard the conventional withdrawal sequencing recommendations. Draw from your taxable accounts first, then draw from your pre-tax accounts second, and then finally leave your Roth accounts for last. This is the advice that all retirement planners use. You'll find this on the internet everywhere. But let me show you Steve and Nancy, right? Through a case study. Steve is 55 and Nancy is 54, and they've just retired early. And here's what they've got. Steve has $1.8 million in pre-tax money in his 401k, and Nancy has $600,000 in pre-tax money in her 401k. Together, they've also got an additional $600,000 in a taxable account, a brokerage account, with a 95% cost basis. That means 95% of the money is already taxed and only 5% is gains. Now, that high cost basis is pretty typical after selling a property, getting an inheritance, or exiting a business, or maybe you've just been a great saver outside of your retirement accounts. Now, in Steve and Nancy's case, they want to spend $100,000 a year. And so here's what they did instead of following the conventional wisdom. And this is what saved them $460,000 over their retirement. So for every year for 10 years, Steve and Nancy withdrew $80,000 from Steve's 401k first. What they did is they drew money up to the standard deduction, then they filled the 10% tax bracket and some into the 12% married tax bracket. They paid for the $5,300 tax bill that generated from their after-tax taxable brokerage account. And then because they want to spend $100,000 in order to live, they pull another $20,000 from that brokerage account to cover the remainder of their spending. So in total, they pull $105,300 a year in order to live on a $100,000 lifestyle. And they do this all while keeping their healthcare premiums subsidized. Now, I know you're thinking, why does that work better than conventional sequencing? And why not just do Roth conversions? And so I'm going to show you later in this video. But to understand that, we need to see what the problems were that Steve and Nancy were facing and why following conventional withdrawal sequencing would have caused them a problem. So the first problem that they faced was healthcare, right? They're 10 years from Medicare. Steve is 55, Nancy is 54. And so they need to keep their modified adjusted gross income under a specific dollar amount. In their case, under $84,600. Otherwise, healthcare costs skyrocket. So if they can keep their income, their modified adjusted gross income under $84,600, then healthcare might cost them around $5,000 a year. But if they go over that threshold by even 1 cent, they could pay as much as $24,000 a year for both of them. So the second problem they have is RMDs. Now, Steve's got a lot in pre-tax accounts, $1.8 million. Nancy has $600,000. Together, that's $2.4 million. And if they ignore their pre-tax accounts early in retirement, by the time they're age 75, they might have over $5 million in pre-tax monies. And that is a threshold after which or above which RMDs do become a problem. The forced distributions from those accounts would be very large and they'd be in higher tax brackets. They'd also end up getting penalized with IRMA surcharges. So a complete tax issue. And then finally, they have a third problem they're trying to solve, which is what's called the widow's penalty. So when Steve dies, Nancy goes from married filing jointly tax brackets to single filer brackets, and she still has the same amount of pre-tax assets she had when Steve was alive, but now she's just taxed in a much less favorable way. On top of that, her IRMA thresholds, which is where you get penalized for Medicare costs, get pushed up as well. So she ends up with a whole bunch of problems if Steve dies while she's still alive, which is likely because he's both older and male. So what does the conventional wisdom tell them to do? Well, the conventional wisdom tells them to live off of their after-tax brokerage account first. And so let's play out that scenario really quickly. Imagine that from years 1 through 6, so age 55 for Steve to age 61 for Steve, they live on their after-tax brokerage account. For the first 6 years, they would withdraw $100,000 a year out of that account. With a 95% cost basis, they effectively have zero taxes. Their modified adjusted gross income is also not something to even think about. And so they end up with healthcare that is free, healthcare premiums that are free. Now, that feels great, but the problem is after 6 years, their $600,000 brokerage account is gone, and they have to figure out what to do in years 7 through 10, which is from age 61 through age 65, so still pre-Medicare. Now, by year 7 of that 10-year timeline, they only have pre-tax money. So all of their lifestyle and all of their spending has to come out of that pre-tax bucket. So healthcare jumps from literally $0 per year to $24,000 per year. Now, on top of that, they still need $100,000 to live on, plus the $24,000 for healthcare, and then they also need money to pay for taxes. And so here's the math. Steve and Nancy would need to pull out $139,000 gross from their 401ks in order to live on $100,000. Now, after taxes and unsubsidized healthcare premiums, they're left with just over $100,000 for spending money. Now, assume they do this for the 4 years, right up until they get to Medicare age. Well, over the 10 years of total timeline that we've just mapped out, the first 6 years, they would spend $600,000 from their brokerage account. And in the final 4 years, they'd spend $556,000 from their pre-tax accounts, resulting in $1.156 million withdrawn over that 10-year period. Now, the problem here is that Steve's 401k, and you can see this on the screen here, at age 65, which is what I'm showing, Steve and Nancy's 401ks total up to $3.4 million. And so they really haven't solved any of the future tax problems with RMDs or widow's tax issues. So they followed the conventional wisdom, right? They got cheap healthcare for 6 years, but they then depleted that account and then they have a tax problem for the rest of their life. Now, let me show you why the strategy that I previewed earlier in this video works so much better. So for the first 10 years of their retirement in this second scenario, Steve and Nancy would do the following. First, they would withdraw $80,000 from Steve's 401k. Steve is 55 and he just left his job to retire. And so the rule of 55 gives him penalty-free access to that pre-tax retirement money. That $80,000 becomes their modified adjusted gross income. Now, they're still under the $84,600 subsidy threshold. And so their healthcare stays subsidized, but it's not free. And they might end up paying about $5,000 a year for their health insurance premiums. And yes, because they're doing pre-tax withdrawals, they will have to pay some taxes as well. But the funds are being withdrawn in 3 highly preferred tax brackets, right? The first $31,500 is withdrawn tax-free because of the standard deduction. The next $23,850 is withdrawn at 10%. And then the final $24,650, that totals $80,000, is withdrawn at 12%. And so their total tax bill to withdraw that $80,000 is $5,300, which is an effective tax rate of 7%, right? Now compare that to the potential 22, 24% or higher that they'd pay at RMD age when they're forced with these bigger distributions and Social Security is kicking in, or compare that to what they might pay 22 or 24% bracket if they wanted to perform Roth conversions while still living on $100,000 a year. Now, they pay that $5,300 tax bill directly from their brokerage account. And this is important. And it's not from their 401k withdrawal because paying for the tax out of the 401k means that there is additional taxable income generated that then requires more money for the tax. And it's like some kind of Inception movie doom loop of taxable income. Every additional dollar you draw the 401k generates more taxable income, meaning you pay more taxes, meaning you need to draw more money out of the account to pay the tax. Finally, they need to make up the spending gap. So they've already withdrawn this $80,000. Now they need $20,000 more to live on. And so they pull that from the brokerage account, effectively tax-free, because of their 95% cost basis. Then total from the brokerage account, they pull $5,300 for taxes and then $20,000 to make up that spending gap. So $25.3K. And so every single year they do $80K out of the 401k and then $25.3K comes out of the brokerage, totaling $105,300. Their net spending money is $100K. Healthcare stays subsidized and costs them about $5K a year. And the best part here is that they can do this each year for that entire 10-year timeline until they hit Medicare age. And by age 65, they will have pulled out $800,000 from Steve's pre-tax 401k. So their pre-tax balance is shrinking substantially, which reduces future RMDs and reduces the amount of pre-tax money that Nancy would end up having if Steve were to pass away. On top of that, their brokerage account still will end up having around $370,000 left in it with this very high cost basis, very tax efficient money. And so at the end of that 10-year scenario, they have withdrawn $1,053,000 compared to the original scenario where they withdraw $1,156,000. So there's an $103,000 difference in how much they have to withdraw in order to live the exact same lifestyle. That's an $103,000 that can stay invested and keep growing for them. And on top of that, they get all sorts of future tax benefits as a result of doing this. So there's a win on both sides. But it gets more interesting. I ran both scenarios through financial planning software, a 40-year retirement, so from Steve's age 55 to age 95. Not only do Steve and Nancy save $103,000 in the first 10 years of retirement, but this strategy actually also saves an additional $352,000 in lifetime taxes, which you can see right here, and results in a $646,000 more in net legacy for their heirs at the end of life. And so the question is, why does this work so well? There are 4 reasons. The first reason was they had proactive pre-tax balance reduction. So by pulling that $800,000 from Steve's 401k at 10 and 12% brackets, they reduced their future tax bill substantially. This means they're not spending their early retirement paralyzed by future tax anxieties. The second reason this works is because healthcare savings. They saved $46,000 in healthcare premiums over the 10 years by maintaining their subsidy eligibility over the entire 10 years. Now, $46,000 is real money, but more than the money was the fact that by getting affordable health insurance, they were more confident to retire at age 55, they could afford to, than they would have been if they had thought they were going to have to pay $25,000 a year for the next 10 years until they got to Medicare age. So it literally enabled the early retirement that they could afford. The third reason that the system works is because the strategy extended the lifespan of their most tax-efficient money, which was their brokerage or their after-tax account. Instead of completely depleting the brokerage account by year 6, it now lasts the full 10 years until they get to Medicare with money left over. And this is their most tax-efficient account, as I said before. The fourth reason this works as well is that this strategy attended to the widow's tax trap. When Steve eventually dies, Nancy inherits a much smaller pre-tax balance, and her RMDs will be more manageable as a result. She'll have less IRMA surcharges, so smaller penalties, maybe no penalties on her Medicare costs, and the widow's penalty gets dramatically reduced overall. So this is intelligent tax planning when you have the right circumstances, right? This is not a trick. It's not a loophole. It's just about being strategic about your withdrawal sequencing. Now, let me answer the question I know you're asking, which is, why not just do Roth conversions? Well, if they converted $80,000 a year to their Roth, they'd have to pay the same $5,300 in tax that we showed in the earlier scenario. But, and this is where things get weird, they still need $100,000 to live on. And so where does that $100K that they need to live on come from? Well, they would have 2 options for this. The first option would be to live on their brokerage funds while they do the conversions. So they'd need $100,000 a year for spending, plus another $5,300 for the conversion taxes. And their total brokerage draw would be $105,300 a year. And then they're withdrawing $80,000 of pre-tax money that they're converting. The problem here is the brokerage account ends up depleted in 5 to 6 years. They just run it dry. And then for years 7 through 10, they're only living off of pre-tax money. On top of that, they're paying full premium health insurance costs pretty much throughout the 10-year time horizon. So they're paying around $24,000 a year, inflating with the cost of health insurance, inflating with the cost of healthcare over that 10-year period. So they're spending a lot for health insurance in order to be able to do these Roth conversions. Now, at the end of that, they end up depleting their most tax-efficient money again, and they've lost their health insurance subsidies. Now, this leads to the second option. So what is the second option? They could withdraw all the money for their living expenses and the conversions from their 401k. So this would effectively lower the balance of the 401k or pre-tax money substantially. And if they do that, they pull $100,000 from the 401k for both living expenses and the $80,000 Roth conversion. Their modified adjusted gross income jumps up. They lose their ACA subsidies once again. They do reduce the balance of their pre-tax monies, but they end up with significantly higher tax costs at the front end of retirement because the inefficiency of pulling pre-tax money to fund the actual lifestyle on top of Roth conversions. Now, the strategic 401k approach that we talked about earlier threads all 3 needles that Steve and Nancy were trying to solve for. It keeps their health insurance subsidies, which enabled their early retirement. It extends the brokerage lifespan, that taxable account's lifespan, and it shrinks their pre-tax balance in a much simpler and easier to execute fashion. Roth conversions can be complicated at times to execute because you have to monitor a whole bunch of complex tax elements. The scenario that I've outlined today has Steve and Nancy using the rule of 55 to pull from their 401k first because of their age. But you could be age 59 and a half, so over the early withdrawal penalty age, or you could be age 60. And the principles that I've shown today would still apply. You could still be a candidate for this type of creative withdrawal strategy if you've met these 3 conditions. The first condition is you have a high cost basis after tax money. It doesn't have to be 95% cost basis like Steve and Nancy, but you'd need a high cost basis with a reasonable amount of after-tax assets. We're talking about, maybe 70% cost basis with an after-tax account of around $300,000 or $400,000. And this would allow you to withdraw money without triggering massive capital gains. Common sources of these types of funds or high cost basis after-tax money include things like proceeds from the sale of a business, inheritance, a real estate sale, a property sale, or downsizing. So these are realistic things that you might expect in your retirement. The second condition you need to meet is you would want to qualify, you're desiring to qualify for ACA healthcare subsidies. You're under 65, so you're not on Medicare yet. You're not receiving Social Security or a pension, which means you have a window of time there where you can control your modified adjusted gross income, and that enables you to opt in for affordable healthcare. The third condition you need to meet is you need to have a large pre-tax, so a 401k or IRA balance. We're talking about potentially as much as $1 million or more in a 401k or IRA, because you need the only way for the pre-tax money to cause a tax problem in the future is if there's enough of it. So if you have a smaller pre-tax account like 300 or 400K, you're probably not going to end up with an issue where you need to get super creative about both Roth conversions or pre-tax withdrawal sequencing like what I've shown today. Now, if you meet these conditions, then withdrawing from a pre-tax account like a 401K first can have significant benefits, right? You're filling low, cheap tax brackets intentionally. You're solving multiple problems simultaneously and setting yourself up for a tax-efficient retirement. So if you want to learn more about strategies just like this, I recorded a free webinar that I call the 4-step system to building your dream retirement. You can watch it for free. Just click the link in the description below this video or scan the QR code that's flashing on the screen now and you can watch it for free. Thanks as always for your time and attention. See you in the next video.